Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Julia Zimmerman, and I serve as the Program Officer for Education, Leadership, and Engagement here at Community Progress. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., and I encourage you to share your name, organization, and where you're signing in from in the chat. Community Progress webinars equip participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's webinar, we're joined by Mallory Rappaport, Program Officer for the National Land Bank Network at the Center for Community Progress, and Valerie Clark, Chief Executive Officer at Revive and Restore Community Corporation. Before turning it over to our speakers, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have questions during the presentation, please submit them via the Q&A box below. We will share slides and a video recording of today's webinar in the week following. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send an email to Julia Zimmerman at events@communityprogress.org. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mallory.
Awesome. Thanks, Julia. I'm gonna get started, share my screen. Great. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Mallory Rappaport. I'm a program officer at Center for Community Progress. And today we're talking about using parcel data to inform strategies for addressing local vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties. If you didn't already know, this webinar is the second in a series of three. If you weren't able to join us last month, we had a webinar on systemic vacancy, its impact, and how it's changed over the last decade, and then also how to tackle bad properties within new realities of the field. This month, we're getting a little more into the weeds. We're focused on parcel data, which is a critical area to explore when tailoring strategies for addressing VAD. And then next month, the third and final of the series, we're focused on neighborhood market data, how to use it to build your VAD strategies. So if you missed last month's webinar, or if you want to join next month's webinar, you can find out more through the resources tab or through the Community Progress website on our events page. So just an overview of what we'll be going through today. First, I'm going to give an overview of parcel level data, what it is, what it looks like, and where you can find some of that information. You may already be collecting more parcel level data than you realize. Then we'll talk through parcel surveys, some examples, some best practices, etc. And then my colleague Valerie Clark will be telling us about a project we conducted and just wrapped up in West Jackson, a parcel condition survey we conducted there. And then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. Feel free, though, as we go about our presentation to drop any questions you might have using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So parcel data is granular level information, but often when folks think about demographic or housing data, they look to big national surveys, things like the US Census, American Community Survey, which is run by the US Census. And those big aggregate information, sometimes the nuance of block to block neighborhood change and impact gets lost. So for an example here, I'm based in Philadelphia. This is the Center City District of Philadelphia, the downtown area, and all the different neighborhoods that make up that area. Within the neighborhood, when we look with it, if you've lived in Philadelphia, or if you've visited Philadelphia and you've walked around, you can see there's a different characteristics that make up each of these neighborhoods, and you really get a different feel as you walk through. But when we look at those neighborhoods by census tract boundaries, those neighborhoods, the tract boundaries don't neatly align with how a community might conceive of the neighborhoods. So most of the neighborhoods you can see have multiple census tracts that cross through them, or census tracts that overlap with other neighborhoods or beyond Center City District. And when we look at that information using a parcel map or with a building footprint, you can see more of the specific characteristics that make up each neighborhood. So you can see here Rittenhouse and Washington Square West have a lot more dense residential parcels, whereas Center City East or Logan Square have much bigger commercial parcels. So parcel level data helps us capture more of the nuance that gets lost in that aggregate. So when I talk about parcel level data throughout this presentation, I'm referring to data available for individual point sources, looking specifically at an address or a parcel with a precise geographic XY coordinate. Parcel level data can help us better understand neighborhood and block level impacts, particularly of vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties. It also helps us identify target parcels or blocks for program interventions. And it can provide more precise cost or number estimates for things like new initiatives, repairs, or demolition. When it comes to parcel level data, there are a number of sources that your municipal or county government may already be collecting. I'll touch on a few types of sources here, but I'm curious if folks have used others to measure or identify the scale of vacant properties in their communities that I don't mention. Feel free to drop them in the chat, mention them. Always looking for different and creative ways that folks have used to to estimate and understand vacancy in their communities. But baseline property information, so things like name, address of owner, type of property, those all point to neighborhood characteristics. Address and name of owner can point to if a property is owner occupied, if the owner is in state or out of state. Knowing information about who's occupying the properties helps tailor the types of programs and strategies we might use to address those properties. Code enforcement records and inspections, particularly when the citations are recurring, unremedied, or unpaid, they can point to property deterioration and abandonment. Police, fire, and 311 calls, especially when they're high in volume, have often been associated with deteriorated or abandoned properties. And then many times the local water or utility agency has information on whether or not a property has service turned on or off, and that also can point to if a property is occupied or not. All of these sources, with consideration of context and place, can help identify where VAD is and some of the root causes and impacts. But sometimes the information you can gather from the administrative parcel data might not fully capture what you need to know about VAD in your community. So that's where parcel surveys come in handy. So sometimes they're known as property condition surveys or windshield surveys, but parcel surveys are self-created data that reflect the status of properties within an identified boundary. So a neighborhood, a city, a county, etc. And they're not to be confused with land surveys, so not these folks, which are measuring property and its boundaries. Rather, parcel surveys are looking at specific property condition and assessment. So parcel surveys can really range. They can be low tech, could be volunteers with clipboards and paper, walking block to block and ranking properties on a scale of excellent to poor, to really high tech. So folks conducting the whole survey virtually or using Google Street View to make assessments. But ultimately, at baseline, a parcel survey captures a point in time assessment of a property and neighborhood's condition. So I'm curious, and I think that, okay, there should be a poll popping up here. Curious, I know we have a wide range of folks in the audience, so I want to know how experienced everyone is in with parcel surveys. So if you want to fill out this poll that just popped up from not experienced to very experienced, what is your level of of experience with this work? And Julia, I can't actually see the responses, so whenever give it a second or two, but whenever you're ready to close the survey. Okay, so it looks like we've got a big range. We've got a lot of folks that just are just learning about it, which is great. And then we've also got a lot of folks that have had some experience working directly with parcel surveys. So I'm very curious, especially for those that have worked with parcel surveys, if you want to share in the chat any links you might have, or just 1 to 2 sentences about where it was that you conducted the survey and your experience doing that. We're always looking for good examples of different communities conducting this work, and we always want to kind of be able to showcase and look at those examples. Okay, so In the field, parcel surveys have varied in terms of questions and information captured. Thinking about the end results when you're designing the survey, thinking about the end results or overall goal for using the survey can help tailor the types of questions that you might want to capture. So perhaps most traditionally, parcel surveys will gather information about property condition, and that could include questions on the condition of the exterior, the of a property, the windows, the roof, etc. Folks often will lean towards capturing vacancy. That's an important metric. Many surveys will look specifically at if a property appears vacant or not. And then street level condition can also be useful, particularly when we're thinking about city or county government improvement opportunities. Understanding factors like street level, street condition, or sidewalk condition can help target programs for neighborhood infrastructure improvements or hazard mitigation. Some other examples of ways that places tailor parcel surveys is by winnowing down to target specific types of inventory. So sometimes surveys will look specifically at publicly owned properties in inventory, or look specifically at structure-free parcels or vacant lots. So now that we've talked about what a parcel survey actually entails, there are some other key elements to consider when designing and conducting one. So thinking about survey method is really critical, whether that's having folks walk from block to block, or a driving survey or windshield survey, as they're sometimes called, which is what Valerie and her team of volunteers did in West Jackson. Or what we've seen cropping up more lately are virtual surveys, which use something like Google Street View or radar to assess properties virtually. Also important to think about who is conducting the survey. There have been a really wide range of strategies over the course of the last decade, from volunteers to staff members. If it's a local or government or organization conducting the survey, sometimes they'll have their own staff complete it. It can also be a really great opportunity for cross-sector partnerships, working with students or universities to help collect and analyze the data. Also important to think about how to compensate your surveyors for what is generally a lot of time spent walking or driving around, whether that's hourly or salary, or some hiring some seasonal employees could also be in form of a stipend, etc. Gear and tech is also an important consideration. We would recommend having surveyors wear something identifiable, whether that's a vest, as pictured here, or a hat. For those doing surveys while driving, having something like a car magnets or identifiable vehicles can be useful. And then on the tech side of things, it's also important to have the right tools, whether that's an iPad with an app loaded to track each property, or again, if we're going this low tech option, having the appropriate clipboards and pens and paper forms. And then timeline is also important to think about. Since parcel condition changes fairly quickly, surveying over a short period of time, so 4 months or less, is really ideal because that can help make sure you're capturing a point in time assessment. Your calendar should also include time for training and troubleshooting with surveyors, and to make sure everyone is on the same page about definitions of different condition types, how to approach scales, etc. And then also you want to make sure you're committing, it's ideal if you're committing to updates over time because conditions change quickly. It's useful to establish a regular cadence or strategy for updates. So this type of data source becomes more useful when you're able to measure impact over time and use it as a living and updated data set. So I have a few examples of some parcel surveys in action, and also the full reports of these surveys are available in the resources section, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. But in 2021, Lucas County Land Bank surveyed 120,000 properties in Toledo. To do that, they hired 10 temporary employees, some of which were eventually hired on as full-time staff members. And their survey questions focused on structure condition, roof repair, tree canopy coverage, and sidewalks. This was the second iteration of this survey as a follow-up to one conducted in 2015. And throughout the report, they applied a lot of lessons learned, and their final report also made notes of changes over time within those two different survey timeframes. Their report also highlights specific neighborhood characteristics, challenges, and needs across the city. And Lucas County Land Bank is a real leader in implementing commitments to equity throughout Toledo, and their survey results were used by the Land Bank to focus strategy and resources. Another example here in Cleveland, their parcel condition survey showcased the power of cross-sector partnerships. The Western Reserve Land Conservancy and City of Cleveland surveyed 162,000 parcels throughout the city from 2022 to 2023. And then the data from the survey is currently being managed by Case Western Reserve University. So they're really pulling in all different stakeholders to this project. Their survey, also like Lucas County, was building on previous surveys done in the area and questions focused on illegal dumping, lead hazards, and property condition. Results for that one are also available online for download and public use, and multiple city departments have used results to deploy resources proactively and conduct proactive maintenance. Great. So I'm going to move on and transition to Valerie. I'm really excited to have Valerie Clark here from Revive and Restore to talk about the parcel condition survey they conducted in Jackson, Mississippi. Community Progress had a really great time supporting this project. I had a really great time working on this project. I think it really epitomizes how resident buy-in and passionate community members can help drive these efforts, and how even with limited resources and a smaller neighborhood scope, the data and findings from these surveys can really equip community members to better talk about VAD and its impacts. So Valerie, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. It is still morning here in Mississippi. Um, I am a lifelong resident of West Jackson here in Mississippi, and I have wonderful memories and experiences from growing up here. I have a large family, and it was five children. We grew up on a block with other uh, families. There were a lot of children, and we played outside a lot. And we did not have to be home when the street lights came on. It was very safe. And we just had a great time growing up here in West Jackson. West Jackson has a lot of history. Pictured here is Jackson State University, that is one of our greatest assets in our target area, and a part of the civil rights movement that happened a lot on Jackson State campus. One of the biggest things that are talked about here is the Gibbs Greens murders that happened on Jackson State's campus. And then very close to Jackson State, there's the COPO building where the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, met often right there in my neighborhood. Growing up during the 70s, I really did not notice a decline in my neighborhood or in my area. There were like two different levels of flight that happened here in Jackson, Mississippi. The first was white flight, essentially moving from urban areas to suburban areas. And that had no real impact on me or my neighborhood. I did not realize or was aware of an impact. The second wave of flight was middle and high income African Americans. That's when I started to notice a decline in my neighborhoods. A lot of those middle and high income African Americans did not immediately move out of the city of Jackson per se. They just moved to other areas outside of the inner core of Jackson. And I have always known that my community, my neighborhood had a lot of potential, and that has kept me here. even through the years of decline, which led me and my best friend. We are the co-founders of Revive and Restore, and we basically created this nonprofit organization out of a deep love for our community. We're both highly engaged in our community, and we really, really love where we live. We also saw that there was a gap in the revitalization efforts that happen in our community. In comparison to some of the other areas in Jackson that have really been able to revitalize and grow, we realized that those areas had dedicated people who were responsible for understanding and knowing what was going on in their community and making plans for their community themselves. And so Revive and Restore is in West Jackson to fill that gap. In addition to that, we're both very passionate about where we live and what we do here in West Jackson. The initial purpose of us wanting to do this windshield survey is that we feel like a lot of what is done in West Jackson and for West Jackson is based on a negative perception of West Jackson and not necessarily the truth. And we wanted to collect this data to dispel assumptions and to provide proof of what we really have here and the true condition and status of our target area. We also know that we needed the tools to properly advocate for ourselves. A lot of times when we were talking to city leaders or state leaders, we would come from a very emotional standpoint, but this data will allow us to advocate from a truthful standpoint where it cannot be argued against that emotional standpoint that we used to use. And then it will help us plan strategically where we go from here, what our next steps are, and how we need to move toward our vision for West Jackson. Mallory.
Yep. So from start to finish, this was really rapid pace. This project took about from September 2025 to March 2026. We really started designing survey questions and the survey tool from September onward. Volunteers did the actual surveying from October to December, and then January to February, we worked on data cleaning, any resurveying that was needed, and then went on this month to analyze results. And we'll be releasing some results, and Revive and Restore will also be releasing results later this month. So when we were designing questions, it's important to note that we didn't make anything from scratch. We were really inspired by other property condition surveys, many of which I've already mentioned throughout this webinar, but built off of their questions and tailored them to fit Jackson. So in order to tailor questions, we considered things like unique housing stock, whether that in Jackson, there are a lot of institutional properties. So they have the Jackson Zoo. There are a number of churches and religious institutions. So we made sure that questions capture that information and that those types of properties were specifically captured beyond just residential, commercial, industrial categories. We also wanted to make sure that specific local problems were identified and there was space to identify those throughout the survey. So in Jackson, there are a number of fire damaged properties. So we made sure that there were questions specific to if there was fire damage and the condition of fire damage as well. We also wanted to, this survey was tailored to West Jackson specifically, but down the line we have hopes of getting information for all of Jackson. And so we wanted to make sure that the questions were scalable to be used citywide. And then, as Valerie mentioned, a core piece of this is being able to tell a positive story as well, or tell stories about the neighborhood and the conditions within the neighborhood. So we also found ways to incorporate questions that would tell positive stories as well as just about property condition. So we have questions on condition change, if a property is undergoing demolition or rehab, et cetera. And then also on different types of vacant lot reuse beyond just it's a side lot or an attached lot, if there are different ways that community members are using the lots. So for the actual survey itself, we used Regrid. There's a lot of different tools that folks use for these types of surveys that can include things like eProperty Plus, Ptolemy, Esri's Survey 123, or building in-house tools. I'm sure there are others that I didn't mention. But for this, we used Regrid. This is what it looked like in app. And when people completed the survey, it looked like this here. And then online, this is what it looked like as folks filled it in. So all of the purple areas are places that a survey had been completed. Valerie, back to you.
Thank you, Mallory. Volunteer selection. Revive and Restore is a very, very new organization. We were founded in February of last year. And so the staff basically consists of me and the co-founder, Heather Logan. So we knew we were going to need some help conducting our surveys. It's a very large area, and lots of parcels for just two people to survey. So when we were ready to select volunteers, we really, really sat down and thought about the people that we knew. And we started, of course, with friends and family. You can often get people to agree to do things for you when they love you. We also leaned heavily on our church family. Heather had several church members join us, and our training that we conducted was actually conducted at my church. And neighbors, when people are vested in what you're doing, when they live where you are working, they will commit a lot of their time to your project. When you're considering who you want to ask, you need to think about people who have the time to commit to your project and what you're doing. So, some suggestions are retirees are often looking for things to fill their days and will assist. We had one retiree who was just awesome, and he did an awesome job. We really enjoyed having him on our team. And you want to have a very, very diverse group of people working to do your surveys. Diversity brings so much wealth of different perspectives and ideas to the table. So our target area here in West Jackson has almost 8,000 total properties. Um, it's a very, very large area. So we started with 12 volunteers, and then Heather and I counted as two. So there were 14 staff people on the ground doing the surveys. And so we really wanted each group of people to have a specific area that they were going to work in. So we divided into 7 groups, teams of 2, and we wanted those areas to be assigned to have relatively comparable in size, taking into consideration the types of the parcels. Because as Mallory mentioned earlier, residentially dense areas have way more parcels than areas that may have more commercial properties, because commercial parcels are usually very large parcels of land. So dividing the target area in a way where one group or one team was not overwhelmed with the number of parcels that they were required to survey. Um, when we were creating our teams of 2, we considered things like the 2 persons' schedules. Were they going to be able to find time to work together? Did their schedules kind of mesh? And then their personalities. You're in a car with this person for a number of hours, driving streets and taking photos. So you want to be able to work well, the 2 people to work well together. And so we took some time to consider each person's personality. The Center for Community Progress came to Jackson, Mississippi, and we were so excited to have Mallory and Janelle here. They conducted our training. We worked with them to create the training materials and to prepare for the 2 day training. So we had training for over 2 days, 2 hours per day. Um, we tried to make sure we picked a training location that was in our target area that would make it easy for us to do some hands-on testing. We wanted to pick a day in which we could give notification to our volunteers in enough time for them to plan ahead to make sure that they could attend the 2 day training. The training was very, very important, and making sure that your volunteers can actually attend the training is very, very critical. On day one, Janelle did an overview of the process and the criteria and the questions that we would be answering in the survey. And then on day two, we kind of reviewed what was went over in day one, and then we did some hands-on testing. Because our training site was in our target area, we could easily walk to survey a couple of properties on day two training and have hands-on question and answering session out kind of in the field, which made the training even more effective because as we looked at properties doing that testing, the volunteers were able to ask questions and get clarification on what they were looking for as far as things like the roof condition. Most of lay people don't understand when a roof looks good or poor. So that was really, really good. And then even after this 2 day training, there was a little bit of ongoing training that happened because when our volunteers were on the ground and conducting questions, they would come across properties and they would have questions. So Heather and I had to be available to kind of continue that training as they had questions as the time went on. Um, Volunteers asked questions on timing, on when they were going to be required to complete all the surveys, and they had a lot of different, I guess, subjective views that when they saw a property, sometimes we would get pictures of properties and say, um, is this just that I don't like the color of this house, or is it really, really something going on with the exterior walls of this property? So managing those subjective views while people were doing the surveys will ensure that your data is as accurate as possible. We had to really, really work through some volunteer time restraints. Life happens to everybody, and things would come up which would limit the time that a volunteer had to commit to doing the surveys. We ran into a couple of issues with the data that Regrid pulled from the Hinds County Land Road data database, where there were some address discrepancies and some parcel number discrepancies, and we had to help our volunteers make sure that they were surveying the correct parcel in Regrid. And we kind of had to work through those things. So that is something to consider. And then we ran into a few little safety issues in some of our areas where the volunteers just did not feel safe in that area, and we really felt like we should have considered the areas beforehand and requested maybe some police presence with our volunteers. So that is also something to consider. So these are examples of what we saw during our surveys. Both of these properties were rated very good. And one thing I want to point out is that when you really, really look at the structure itself and not the aesthetic of the structure, looking at the brick house, the lawn is well manicured and the grass is all green and plush. and the structure of the property is very well maintained. The blue house, on the other hand, the paint is a little faded, the lawn is not as lush, but when you look at the actual structure, the condition of the exterior walls and the roof and the windows, both would be rated as very good properties. So how can you tell the difference between very good and good? So some things to consider is the property on the right, the yellow house, wouldn't receive a very good rating because you can see some water staining on the roof. They may need some minor um, repairs to their roof. And then the other house just has some minor structural issues going on around the porch area that would prevent us from rating it as very good. When you're rating a property as fair, there may be some issues that you see. Um, the blue house definitely has some siding that has been replaced but not painted. The windows could use some attention, so we would be apprehensive about rating that house as good or very good. It's not in poor condition, but it needs some repair work done on it, on the blue and the green. And then poor. Major issues and significantly distressed. They need a lot more work than a house that we rate as fair would need. Not necessarily just from a windshield survey can determine if that house needs to be demolished. It may be salvageable. So you have to consider whether or not it's just so far gone that it just needs to be torn down. And that kind of determines whether you rate it as poor or very poor. As you can see on this slide, the very poor properties are just way, way gone. They are not attractive and they're just not safe. And the best thing for very poor properties would be to demolish them. Lessons learned. So I would suggest that you have backup volunteers. As I said, life happens. And sometimes you have someone that starts out and they just are unable to finish because something has happened in their lives that will prevent them from finishing the process. So having a pool of volunteers that you can gather together to help finish out your survey process would be a good idea. And then when you're thinking about the number of volunteers that you need, kind of limit each volunteer to about 400 parcels. That prevents burnout and will help get the parcel survey completed in a more timely manner. We ran into a serious issue when we were doing our surveys. We started in November and we just did not consider daylight savings time. And in the middle of us doing our surveys, it started getting dark about 5 o'clock. So our volunteers that work full-time jobs could not survey Monday through Friday. We would do it again in the springtime when it stays daylight until about 8. So you would have more daylight during the week, and that would give you more time to complete your surveys. Have a contingency plan for unforeseen parcel issues. We were unaware of the fact that we had so many parcels that were just inaccessible that you could not get to. It was either a parcel that was behind the house, that was a whole separate parcel than the parcel that the house sat on, that was just not visible to us, and we couldn't take a picture of it, and we couldn't survey. So have a plan for how you're going to address those parcels. You may want to have just some kind of blanket um, response to the survey questions for those types of parcels, but having that contingency plan will help you have complete data for every single solitary parcel in your target area. Um, do a pre-assessment drive-through. As I mentioned, we ran into some safety issues in some areas that neither me or my co-founder knew that that area was as bad as it was. Our target area is large and we live in this community, but some areas we just didn't drive down on a regular, consistent basis. So just do a pre-assessment drive-through so you can identify problem areas beforehand and you can plan for those areas. We had a volunteer to say about third week, this is so boring. The survey process can get mundane for your volunteers. So try to schedule some times during your survey period where your volunteers can get together, reconnect, tell stories, and kind of get re-energized in the middle of your survey process. So just a quick rundown of some of the data that we collected. I just want to say we have so much data. We are scrambling to try to decide how we're going to move forward with all the data we have, and we're very excited. So our total parcel count was 7,426. We did not survey all of our parcels. One of the things we ran into is on Jackson State's campus, there were a lot of parcels that made up one building, and it was just going to be difficult to survey all of those parcels that made up Jackson State University. So we decided to just skip those parcels altogether, which decreased our total parcel count. Of our total 7,426 parcels that were surveyed, most of our parcels have a structure on it, and that's very, very good. As I stated earlier, there were some parcels that we could not survey, they just were not accessible, and that was 206 of our total parcels. This is a great map created by the Center for Community Progress for us that shows the overall condition of our target area as a visual. And the one thing I love pointing out about this beautiful map is that our target area in West Jackson has very much more blue and light blue than we have red or yellow. It really, really stands out and creates a visual that our target area is not as bad as some of the perceptions of what people say. It's very it's a good tool to have. So on the property conditions, more of our properties, as the map shows, are rated very good or good as opposed to poor and very poor. And that's not to say that we don't need to address the poor and very poor, but I think it gives us a leg to stand on when we're talking to people and when we're advocating for our area or we're talking to developers. Don't let the negative perception that you hear about this area fool you. So we have that concrete data to show that now, which is awesome. 24% of the very poor properties in West Jackson are owned by the city or the state, which is a big issue that we are already starting to think through strategically how we address that issue with our state and city government, our leaders, how we talk about this problem and come up with a system for resolving that issue. It's going to be a big part of some of the things that we do with our next steps. So there are several data points that we kind of want to layer on top of this wonderful data that we collected during our windshield survey. One of the first things we want to do is we want to understand how the tax sale process, when a property becomes tax delinquent, affects our area as far as the number of poor and very poor structures that are in our area. And then we also want to know what is the tax collection data say in our area? How much is our area actually contributing to the tax base for both our city, our county, and our state? We also want to understand which of our occupied residential structures are actually owner occupied. The more that the homeowners can band together to advocate for ourselves, the better stance we will have. So we will do some strategic planning based on some of the neighborhoods that are identified in our target area. We have several different neighborhood associations represented in this one target area, and we will be working closely with those neighborhood associations to come up with plans to move forward on those areas based on this data that we collected. And then there are some street level planning that will concentrate on a specific street. We noticed that there were some streets that were almost all good and very good, and they may have had three parcels that were either fair or poor that could be easily addressed to just shore up that whole street and make it more um, adverse to decline. And then we plan to advocate really, really hard with our local leaders on the appropriate interventions for our area. I think now we have the data that we need to talk more from an intelligent standpoint of what's going on in our community than we have been in the past from a very, very emotional standpoint of the things that are happening in our community. And we're very excited to have this data to be able to advocate for ourselves more effectively. All right, Mallory.
Okay, thank you, Valerie. That was really great. So just before we get to Q&A, I wanted to share again, we have that webinar I mentioned at the start next month on neighborhood housing markets. If you're interested, I believe the link is in the resources folder button on the bottom of your screen. And then Valerie gave you a sneak peek of the survey results, but we will continue sharing and kind of going through them over the course of till the end of this month and next month as well. Valerie and Heather at Revive and Restore are doing a local community data briefing later this month, and then they'll also be planning on going to different community meetings to talk through the survey results. If you're local to Jackson and you're interested, follow along on their Facebook page or their website to see any updates on that. And then also as part of attending this webinar, we're going to be emailing out the key findings, three-page brief to all participants included in the resources, along with a recording of this session. Great. Okay, so I saw a number of questions coming in, so keep them coming if you have any. We still have a good amount for a few questions. Um, Let me just take a look. So I think there were a few clarification questions in terms of accessing public or private property. All these surveys were conducted on the street. So anything that volunteers were able to access from the road, anything on the road itself. And so no private property was accessed for this survey. So any properties that extended beyond the road itself, those weren't included. Those were usually marked as inaccessible, which Valerie talked about a little bit when going through the survey results. There are also a number of properties, yeah, that were totally inaccessible or that just you weren't able to access via the street or see via the street. Typically, those were also marked as inaccessible. Folks asked why we decided to use Regrid. Regrid was the best option for us just for this survey. I think a lot of folks often use tools that they have available to them. So if they're, if we're coming from a city organization or entity and you're already using a different tool, I would highly recommend incorporating it into the tool that you already use. A lot of these different systems that folks use for tracking properties and looking at properties throughout the city can do some of the survey technology. And I think it makes for a very useful integration if you're able to overlay, whatever data you are already collecting. Again, some of that administrative parcel data that I was talking about earlier with these survey results. Valerie, there was a question that I think you would be great to answer about what folks thought while you were going around, because I know that volunteers did interact with members of the community, folks living in the community, and so what those interactions were like.
Sure. Yeah, while we were surveying, we did have magnets on the cars that just said Revive and Restore Surveyor. We did have a couple of residents that come out and say, hey, hey, what are you doing? Are you taking a picture of my house? And most of the time, when we explained what we were doing and why we were doing, they got very, very excited about the possibilities that could come from collecting this type of data. There were a few times where the residents said, no, don't take a picture of my house. I don't want my house surveyed. And we always advised our volunteers to just move on. And if the opportunity arise for you to go back to that property, maybe when they're not home to complete the survey, then do it that way. But be very, very respectful if they say they did not want their property surveyed. There was one instance when we were out surveying. Uh, the resident came out and wanted to know, was it the landlord? The landlord got you taking pictures, and so you can get some questions when you're out surveying. Just be honest, tell them what you're doing, and if they ask you not to, then just move on and try to come back at a later time to capture that data.
Someone asked, how long did the collection process itself take? Volunteers were out from October to December, and then Valerie and Heather did some additional, anything we missed, anything we needed additional responses to in January. So about October, November, December, about three to 4 months of actual surveying. Let's see, any other questions? Some folks asked about the length of the survey. So it wasn't just looking at condition, overall condition. We broke condition down by each, different factor. So asking about the roof, asking about the siding or the brick, asking about porches, windows, etc., vegetation, any trash on the parcel. There were a lot of questions. I believe about 30, though not all parcels got had all 30 questions asked about them. There were different kind of logic and tracks depending on if a parcel was vacant or if it had a structure on it. But yeah, as Valerie mentioned, we have a lot of data and there's a lot of different ways that we can go about overlaying other parcel data, looking at other information throughout the city. So I think Revive and Restore, I know, has some big plans for how they're planning on using and analyzing this information down the line. Valerie, do you have any plans to share data or compare notes with local code enforcement officials or any members of the city?
Yes, definitely. We have already started a Bright Paths program for the area directly around our elementary school in our one of the elementary schools in our target area. Um, our school system has a designated kind of feeder pattern where the elementary schools feed into the middle school and then the middle school feeds into two separate high schools. And so one of our elementary schools has a lot of poor and very poor around the school that the children can see on their way to school and on their way home. And we're going to work with code enforcement to try to address those just around the block where the school is at. A lot of them are on the backside where the playground is at. So when they're playing outside on the playground, what they see across the street is not appealing. And working with the planning department here with the city of Jackson will be a very, very critical step in that.
Someone asked if there were any parcels identified that contained more than one structure, where one was in good condition and another in poor condition, and how that was handled at the parcel level.
So one of the questions that was included in our survey was are there any accessory structures? And if there was an accessory structure on the property, and then we were clear that a accessory structure did not mean garage or a gazebo or something like that, like a full additional property on that
Well,
same
four
parcel.
walls. Yeah.
Yeah, and a roof.
Hmm.
So if the surveyor selected yes, there was an accessory structure, then it took them to a question to answer about the condition of that accessory structure. We didn't have a whole lot of accessory structures. There were a few parcels that were rated on that accessory structure line, but we did not see that a lot in our target area.
Julia, are we close to time? Or do we have time for one or two more questions? I think we did a number of these, to be honest. I'm looking through. If there are any questions that we didn't get to, that we didn't answer, please do feel free to email me or Valerie. Happy to talk through with you all or answer any remaining questions. Thank you all so much for joining.
Hi everyone. Sorry, my computer keeps freezing, which is cool and fun. Awesome. Thank you so much for such a great webinar, Mallory and Valerie. Like Mallory said, we have another webinar in a month about neighborhood markets. And we hope to see all of you there. You can register in the resources tab. And I'm dropping a survey in the chat right now. If you could fill it out, it'll really help us improve future webinars. Thanks so much for joining, everyone. Have a good afternoon.